No one ever imagined that the quiet girl sitting in the corner of class would solve a physics riddle that even professors and top students couldn't crack. Everyone always looked at the front of the room, but no one ever turned toward the far back corner. Someone always sat there, silent, hunched like a shadow. Her name was Eliza Rowe. She wasn't the type people knew, let alone praised. Not a single teacher ever called her name in class. Even her own physics teacher, Mr. Raymond, barely acknowledged her presence. That morning, sunlight filtered into the classroom of Dalton Academy, a prestigious school nestled just outside Seattle. Known for its academic achievements and science competitions, the school was also a harsh place for anyone who didn't fit the mold. Mr. Raymond stood confidently at the board, lecturing about magnetic fields like he was teaching a university seminar. Students at the front rows scribbled notes quickly. Valerie, the popular girl with a perfect academic record, raised her hand first to answer every question. Joshua, the son of a physics professor, interrupted with lengthy explanations. But in the very back, Eliza remained silent. Her hand clutched a cracked pen. Her notebook was filled with incomplete equations and messy sketches. No one paid attention to her. Even when Mr. Raymond handed out a pop quiz, he walked right past her desk without a word. In the hallway afterward, Valerie whispered to her friend, "I don't even know why she's still here. I don't think she can talk." Joshua chuckled. "Maybe she thinks school is just free daycare." Eliza heard all of it, but she didn't respond. She didn't cry. She just stared at the chalkboard from earlier, etched in her memory. There was something in that equation that kept tugging at her, like a puzzle piece begging to be placed. That afternoon after class, she walked home along wet sidewalks lined with falling autumn leaves. Her house was small, near the edge of town. Her mother folded laundry while listening to an old radio. Her father worked as a mechanic. There were no science books in the house. No computer. But that night, Eliza sat on the floor of her room. With just a pen and a piece of crumpled paper, she redrew the equation from memory. Her hand began sketching vector lines and small graphs. She didn't know it yet, but on that very paper, everything was about to change. Mr. Raymond had no idea that the girl he always overlooked was preparing a shock that would shake the entire school. It happened on a Thursday morning, just after the bell rang for second period. Mr. Raymond stood in front of the class, holding a printed sheet of paper with a smirk on his face. Behind him, the chalkboard had been wiped clean, except for one line written in bold. "Solve this. The oscillation-rotation paradox." The students leaned forward, curious. The room buzzed with whispers. Joshua narrowed his eyes. Valerie raised an eyebrow. Mr. Raymond tapped the board with the back of his pen. "This," he said, "is a riddle that has puzzled college students for years. It's part of a thought experiment in theoretical physics. Solve it, and you're not just smart, you're exceptional." He paused, looking around the room with a dramatic flair. "Anyone who cracks this will receive my personal recommendation letter to any science program in the country, including MIT." The class gasped. Joshua leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. "Finally," he whispered to himself. Valerie instantly opened her notebook. "Let's get to work." But in the back corner, Eliza didn't move. She stared at the board. Her eyes blinked slowly. The paradox, she had heard of it before. In a random science podcast her father once played in the garage. It was a riddle involving rotational energy and waveforms. So obscure, most high schoolers wouldn't even understand the terms. As the week went on, Mr. Raymond gave no hints. Students grouped up, forming alliances like it was a war. Diagrams filled whiteboards. Equations danced across pages. Joshua brought in printouts from his father's university lectures. Valerie consulted her private tutor. They presented possible solutions every day after class. But Mr. Raymond always shook his head. "No," he would say. "Too shallow. You're missing the symmetry." Meanwhile, Eliza sat alone. Her only companion was the sound of her pencil scratching paper and the ticking clock above the blackboard. She watched the others with calm eyes, absorbing everything. Then she'd go home, eat dinner quietly, and return to her corner with her notebook. At night, she dreamed in diagrams. Her thoughts were filled with rotating masses, waveform anomalies and frictionless planes. She saw the riddle not as numbers, but as movement, motion in space, spiraling silently. One afternoon, as Valerie loudly argued with Joshua over a mistake in his formula, Eliza stood up. She walked to Mr. Raymond's desk, holding a folded piece of paper. She didn't say anything. She just placed it in front of him and walked back to her seat. Mr. Raymond looked confused. He waited until the bell rang and the students cleared the room. Then he opened the paper. There was a full-page solution, completely handwritten, filled with vectors, integration boundaries, and a final simplified answer. It wasn't just correct. It was elegant. He stared at it for a long time. His fingers tightened around the page. That night, Mr. Raymond didn't sleep, because for the first time in his 18 years of teaching physics, someone had solved the paradox, and it was the one student he had never once called on. The next morning, Mr. Raymond arrived at school before sunrise. His eyes were red from staying up all night, reviewing Eliza's work over and over. He had even emailed the scanned copy to his old colleague at Stanford, just to be sure he wasn't imagining things. Before first period began, he stood alone in the teacher's lounge, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the paper once again. There was no error. The math flowed with clarity. The logic was tight, and the final result aligned perfectly with theoretical expectations. It was, by all accounts, the kind of solution you might expect from a graduate-level physics student. But it came from a girl who never raised her hand. A girl he had dismissed since the day she walked into his class. Back in the classroom, students began arriving one by one. Joshua carried a stack of textbooks under his arm. Valerie wore her usual confidence like perfume, flipping her hair as she walked in. Mr. Raymond didn't say a word. Not yet. He watched Eliza quietly take her seat in the back corner. As always, she opened her notebook and began writing in the margins, formulas, arrows, quiet thoughts only she seemed to understand. When the bell rang, Mr. Raymond cleared his throat. "I need your attention," he said, placing a copy of the riddle on the board again. As you all know, this challenge was not for a grade. It was to test insight. He paused, letting the tension build. This morning, I received a solution. A complete one. A ripple went through the class. Joshua sat upright. "You mean someone actually solved it?" Valerie smirked. "It's probably wrong." Mr. Raymond didn't respond. Instead, he walked to Eliza's desk and gently placed a folded paper in front of her. "This came from Eliza Rowe," he said, his voice steady. The class fell completely silent. No one said a word. Valerie blinked rapidly, looking between Mr. Raymond and Eliza. Joshua frowned, visibly confused. "But she never even spoke in class," Valerie said, her voice cracking slightly. "She didn't need to," Mr. Raymond replied. "Her work spoke for her." He looked at Eliza. "Would you mind sharing your thought process with class?" Eliza's fingers tightened around her pencil. Her face remained unreadable. For a second, the room felt like it had stopped breathing. Then she slowly shook her head. "No," she said softly. It was the first time most of them had ever heard her voice. The room stayed silent for another moment. And then Mr. Raymond simply nodded. "Very well," he said. "I'll respect that." But in that pause and the stunned faces around her, something shifted. Eliza didn't need to explain. The silence was her stage. And in that silence, she had just taken control of the entire room. By lunchtime, the entire school had heard. The quiet girl from physics class had solved a riddle that not even college students could touch. Rumors swirled faster than wildfire. Some said Mr. Raymond had made it up. Others said Eliza had cheated, copied it from the internet, or gotten help from a private tutor. None of it was true, but truth didn't travel as fast as doubt. In the cafeteria, students looked at Eliza differently. She still sat alone, at the far end of the table near the windows, nibbling on a sandwich wrapped in foil. Valerie passed her tray, glancing at Eliza like she was looking at a stranger. Joshua walked by without a word, gripping his drink cup so hard it crinkled. "They're scared of you now," said a voice. Eliza turned. A boy named Omar from her biology class stood beside her. He usually kept to himself too, But now he was smiling. "That was insane what you did," he said, pulling up a chair without waiting for permission. "You know they're all talking, right?" Eliza nodded slightly, then returned to her sandwich. He leaned forward, whispering, "Was it really you?" Eliza didn't answer. Instead, she opened her notebook and flipped to a page filled with swirling diagrams and notations. She pushed it slightly toward him. Omar blinked. "Wait, is this the next part?" Eliza simply shrugged, then gently pulled the page back. After lunch, the whispers grew louder. In Mr. Raymond's office, an email pinged on his laptop. It was from Professor Kent, a theoretical physicist at Stanford. Subject: Eliza Rowe's submission. Text: "This solution is not only correct, it's deeply original. Who is this student? Call me." Mr. Raymond exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. Then he looked at the stack of graded tests on his desk. Most were filled with rote memorization. Eliza's paper wasn't just an answer. It was a question turned inside out, deconstructed and rebuilt in her own way. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Valerie leaned against her locker while a group of students asked her if she was okay. "She probably just copied it," she muttered. But Mr. Raymond said, "He doesn't know everything." Valerie cut in sharply. "People like Eliza, they don't just suddenly become geniuses overnight." But no one responded. They were all wondering the same thing. If Eliza Rowe had been hiding this level of intelligence all along, what else had she been hiding? The following week, on a cloudy Wednesday morning, a black sedan pulled into the Dalton Academy parking lot. Its windows were tinted, its engine quiet, but the presence of the car alone stirred curiosity. No one ever saw vehicles like that around school, unless someone important had arrived. Mr. Raymond was in the middle of explaining a lab experiment when the door to his classroom opened. The assistant principal stepped in, face pale with nervousness. "Mr. Raymond," she said, "there's someone here to see you." "From Stanford." Gasps spread across the room like a wave. "Now?" Mr. Raymond asked, confused. The assistant principal nodded. "He asked specifically to observe your class." As the students murmured, a tall man with silver hair and a long coat stepped into the room. He looked around with eyes that seemed to measure everything, from the posters on the walls to the layout of the desks, before offering a polite smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "I'm Professor Kent, Theoretical Physics Department." Joshua sat up straighter in his seat. Valerie looked genuinely stunned for the first time in her academic life. Professor Kent turned to Mr. Raymond. "I read a student submission last week. It was remarkable. I had to see it for myself." He scanned the room, his gaze passing over each student, until it stopped at the back corner. Eliza didn't flinch. She merely met his eyes. The professor smiled. "Eliza Rowe?" She nodded. "Do you mind if I speak with you after class?" The class stared. No one dared to speak. The rest of the period passed like a blur. Mr. Raymond lost track of his notes. Joshua's pencil stopped moving. Valerie looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't. When the bell rang, the students slowly filed out. Many turned their heads to get one last look at Eliza. She didn't leave. She stayed in her seat. Professor Kent took the chair beside her, opened his satchel, and placed a folder on the desk. Inside was her solution, printed, marked, and annotated with glowing remarks. He leaned in slightly. "I've been teaching physics for over 30 years, he said quietly, "and I've never seen a student your age think like this. Where did you learn to do this?" Eliza looked down at her hands, then back at him. "In my head," she said. Professor Kent chuckled, not mockingly, but in genuine awe. "I want to offer you a place in our Young Scholars program. You'd be working directly with doctoral students. You'll have access to our labs, our mentors, our archives." He paused. "All expenses paid." At the door, Mr. Raymond stood motionless. For the first time in his life, a student had outpaced not just the curriculum, but the very foundation it was built on, and she had done it quietly from the very back of the room. By the time the last class ended that day, the news had already reached every hallway, every phone, and every group chat. Eliza Rowe had been offered a direct opportunity by Stanford University. No entrance exam. No application. Just talent. Some students were excited. Others were stunned. But a few were angry. That afternoon, Valerie stormed into the study lounge where Joshua was flipping through his notes. "Are we really just going to act like she's some kind of genius now?" she said sharply. "I've been in every honors class since freshman year. I've won national competitions. And now she solves one riddle, and suddenly she's a prodigy." Joshua looked up, tired. "She didn't just solve it. She crushed it. You saw the professor's reaction." Valerie crossed her arms. "She got lucky. She probably found the answer online. No one even watched her work through it." Joshua stood, eyes narrowing. "Then why don't you try proving it's fake?" Valerie froze, because deep down, she knew she couldn't. Meanwhile, Mr. Raymond sat alone in his office, the soft tick of the wall clock keeping him company. On his desk sat a manila folder labeled Eliza Rowe Recommendation. He opened it slowly, staring at the blank page. What kind of letter could possibly describe her? He thought back to all the times he had walked past her desk, the assignments he didn't collect, the questions he never asked. He closed the folder. Then he picked up his pen and began to write, not as a teacher trying to help a student, but as a witness trying to describe something rare. Across the campus, Eliza stood by her locker, zipping up her worn-out backpack. Her hoodie was still faded, her shoes still scuffed, and yet people parted in the hallway as she walked. No one said a word. No one mocked her. They simply watched. That night, her mother sat beside her at the kitchen table, holding the printed letter from Stanford with trembling hands. Her father, still wearing grease-stained jeans from the auto shop, just stared at the bold university logo. "You're really going to California?" he asked, voice low. Eliza nodded. Then she opened her notebook, its pages filled with spirals of thought, and said something she had never said before. "I'm not done yet." The next morning, Eliza was called into the principal's office. The hallway felt longer than usual. Her steps were quiet, but each one echoed. Students passed by her with a mixture of awe and confusion, like they were watching something impossible happen in real time. Inside the office, Principal Lattimore sat behind a wide wooden desk, flanked by 2 members of the school board and the assistant principal. On the table was a printout of the email from Professor Kent, a glowing report, a once-in-a-generation mind, an offer that rarely came without intense competition. But their expressions weren't joyful. They were concerned. "Eliza," Principal Lattimore began carefully, "this is unprecedented. You put our school on the map, but this kind of attention also brings questions." Eliza sat still, her backpack still slung over her shoulder. The assistant principal leaned in. "Some parents have already called. They want to know if the test was fair, if the process was transparent." One of the board members added, "They're asking why a student with no record competition, no extracurricular activity, and no leadership roles is suddenly being presented as the school's brightest mind." Eliza's hands remained folded on her lap. She didn't speak. Principal Lattimore continued, "We're not accusing you of anything, Eliza, but we need to protect the integrity of the school. So we decided to form a small review committee." She looked up. "To review what?" she asked quietly. "To verify the originality of your work," the board member said. "We'll ask for a re-derivation, a step-by-step oral explanation with witnesses." The room fell silent again. Mr. Raymond, who had just entered, spoke from the corner. "You're putting her on trial," he said flatly. "No," the principal replied. "We're just making sure the process is fair." Mr. Raymond walked to Eliza's side. She already proved herself. You didn't believe in her before. Now that you can't explain it, you assume it must be fake. "We're asking for clarity, not punishment," the assistant principal said. Eliza stood slowly. She pulled her notebook from her backpack, flipped it open, and laid it flat on the table. Every page was dated, every step documented, from the earliest attempts to the final breakthrough. Handwriting consistent. No sign of copy diagrams. No sudden jumps in thought. She closed the notebook. "You can watch," she said, voice calm, "but you don't have to understand it." The board members looked stunned. Then she turned and walked out, leaving her notebook behind. Outside, Mr. Raymond followed her into the hallway. "You didn't have to do that," he said gently. She looked up at him. "Yes, I did," she replied, "because they think quiet means weak." Mr. Raymond exhaled, and for the first time he didn't see Eliza as a student. He saw her as something more. 2 days later, the entire senior class was invited to the school auditorium under the vague headline of a special academic presentation. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but whispers filled the air. Eliza's going to be tested again. They're making her solve it live. Maybe she just got lucky the first time. Students filed into their seats as the stage lights warmed the velvet curtain. At the center of the stage stood a tall whiteboard on wheels, surrounded by 4 chairs. 3 were filled by members of the review committee. The 4th was for her. Mr. Raymond stood backstage, gripping a clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had been asked to moderate the session, not by choice, but because no one else knew enough physics to follow her explanation. The crowd went quiet as Eliza stepped onto the stage. She wore the same faded hoodie and jeans. No makeup, no fancy outfit. Just her, and the notebook tucked under her arm. She sat calmly. The assistant principal began. "Eliza Rowe has agreed to walk us through her solution to the oscillation-rotation paradox. This is not a test. This is an opportunity for clarity and learning." Eliza said nothing. She stood, approached the board, and began to write. She didn't read from her notes. She didn't pause. Her hands moved with purpose, drawing waveforms and angular momentum arcs. Her voice was steady and clear. "The paradox lies in how rotational energy is conserved across frames of reference," she said. "But the missing term is often masked by a false assumption about initial displacement." The audience blinked wide-eyed. Even the review board began to lose track of her thinking. But Mr. Raymond followed it. Every line, every turn. She wasn't just repeating a memorized formula. She was teaching it. By the end of her presentation, the whiteboard was filled with complex notations and interlocking equations, but the flow of logic was unbroken. She capped the final line with a soft click of her marker, turned around, and stepped back. "I'm finished," she said. The auditorium remained dead silent. Then one person clapped. Then another. Then an explosion of applause broke through. It wasn't just appreciation. It was shock, respect, awe. Backstage, Professor Kent had returned for presentation. He stepped onto the stage, shook her hand, and whispered something only she could hear. "You're already beyond most of my first-year grad students." After the session, Principal Lattimore approached her with a trembling voice. "Eliza, I owe you an apology." Eliza nodded politely but said nothing, because this time her silence wasn't a weakness. It was power. The day after the auditorium presentation, everything changed. Students who used to pass Eliza without a glance now slowed down when they saw her in the hallway. Some offered a shy wave. Others, like Omar from biology class, gave her a thumbs up without saying a word. Even the teachers began to treat her differently. Mr. Hale, the chemistry instructor who had once skipped over her during labs, now invited her to join the advanced project team. Mrs. Carter from the math department asked if Eliza would be willing to tutor younger students. It wasn't praise she had wanted. It wasn't even the attention. It was the silence being replaced by something real. Respect. But not everyone was ready to accept the change. Valerie stood in the student lounge with her usual group, arms crossed, trying to act unbothered. "She's still just a fluke," she muttered. One of her friends replied, "She made Professor Kent fly here from California." Valerie didn't respond. Later that week, a student newspaper article featured Eliza on the front page. The headline read, "The Girl Who Solved the Impossible." It included a full interview, which Eliza had agreed to only after being assured there would be no photos. The writer had asked her what it felt like to be invisible for so long, and Eliza had replied, "I wasn't invisible. I was observing." That line echoed through campus for days. Meanwhile, Mr. Raymond had begun rethinking his entire teaching approach. He stood in front of his class one morning, looking out at the rows of students, many of whom he had always favored for their loudness, their hand-raising, their fast answers. But now he paused. Now he waited longer after every question. He let the silence settle, because he had learned that silence could be thinking, too. That week, Eliza received a formal package in the mail from Stanford. Inside was a full offer for early entry into the university's youth research program. Housing, tuition, travel, everything covered. The letter came with a handwritten note from Professor Kent. You don't need to raise your voice. You've already changed the conversation. Eliza placed the letter on her desk and looked out the window of her small bedroom. The town below looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She finally folded the letter and placed it in her backpack, not to show off, not to brag, but because it was just the beginning. Just as the excitement began to settle and routines returned to Dalton Academy, a new announcement caught everyone off guard. Mr. Raymond entered the classroom one crisp Friday morning, carrying a small white envelope. He tapped the desk lightly and said, "Before we begin, I have something special." He pulled out a folded letter and read aloud. The Northwest Regional Physics Challenge will be hosting a final invitational round due to the unusual nature of this year's entries. A single student from Dalton Academy has been selected to represent the school. He paused. Her name is Eliza Rowe. The class was silent for a long second, and then the murmurs began. Valerie froze. Her pencil dropped to the floor. Joshua looked over at Eliza with wide eyes, but not with jealousy, with anticipation. Mr. Raymond continued, "This is not a typical test. It's not multiple choice. It's a live challenge. You'll be given one problem. You'll have 2 hours in front of an academic panel." Eliza looked up from her notebook. "Where?" she asked. "Washington University." He replied, "Next Saturday." She gave a slow nod. At home, her parents sat with her that evening at the dinner table. The invitation letter lay between the three of them. Her mother wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes watery with pride. Her father leaned back in his chair, saying nothing, just watching his daughter with quiet intensity. "Do you want to do it?" her mother finally asked. Eliza didn't speak right away. Instead, she opened her notebook again and wrote something, a diagram, a flow, a mental rehearsal. Her mind had already begun the process. It was not a question of wanting. It was already in motion. The next week passed in fragment of time, each hour soaked in whispers, stares, and quiet energy. Teachers paused their lessons to wish her luck. A few brave students offered kind words. Even Valerie had stopped trying to discredit her. On Friday afternoon, as Eliza packed her bag for the trip, she stood quietly at the edge of the school courtyard. Mr. Raymond approached and handed her a sealed envelope. "Open it after the competition," he said. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, without a word. The next morning, she boarded the train to Washington University. Alone, no entourage, no cheering team, just her thoughts, her calm, and one last test waiting at the end of the line. The university campus was quiet that morning. Dew still clung to the iron railings, and the sun hadn't fully risen above the rooftops when Eliza arrived. She was met by a staff coordinator, who led her through the old brick halls of the physics department. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past geniuses, young men and women who had changed the world with formulas and theorems. But Eliza didn't look at them. Her focus was straight ahead. They reached a large room encased in glass, where 3 professors sat behind a long table. One of them was Professor Kent, though he wore no trace of the warmth he'd shown her before. This was a different space. This was a test. In the center of the room stood a whiteboard, clean, untouched. On the table beside it lay a single sheet of paper, folded once. The lead examiner cleared his throat. "Eliza Rowe, welcome," he said. "This is a final challenge. You will be given one complex problem. You have 2 hours to derive, explain, and conclude your reasoning. No assistance, no reference materials." He pushed the paper forward. "You may begin when ready." Eliza stepped forward, unfolded the paper, and read silently. Her eyes moved slowly, absorbing the language of the riddle. It was built on advanced fluid dynamics, layered with non-inertial frame variables. It wasn't just difficult, it was unorthodox. The kind of problem designed to disorient. But Eliza didn't flinch. She walked to the whiteboard, uncapped the marker, and began writing. Slowly at first, then faster. The professors watched in silence. Occasionally, one would whisper to another. Professor Kent, though silent, kept his eyes fixed on her hand movements. How she traced symmetry where she paused, where she skipped ahead. Eliza spoke as she worked. She explained the premise, then the flaw in the assumed boundary. She redrew the entire system from a moving observer's frame. Her voice never wavered. She made no effort to impress, only to express. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then the final equation took form. Eliza stepped back. The board was full. She capped the marker and turned around. I'm finished, she said. The lead examiner stood and approached the board, running his eyes along every line. He said nothing, only breathing deeply, as if stunned by what he was seeing. Professor Kent joined him. Flawless, he muttered under his breath. Outside the room, through the glass, a few graduate students had stopped to watch. Even they couldn't hide their astonishment. The lead examiner returned to his seat and tapped the table. We'll have a decision within the hour, he said. Eliza nodded and quietly left the room, her heart pounding, but her face still calm. She sat on a bench outside beneath a tall maple tree. And then she remembered the envelope, the one Mr. Raymond gave her. She tore it open carefully and unfolded the note inside. No matter what they say in there, you've already passed the only test that matters. The one where you prove to yourself that your voice is real. For the first time in a long while, Eliza smiled, not because of what she might receive, but because she finally knew what she carried inside her could no longer be ignored. The hour felt longer than the test itself. Eliza sat alone beneath the maple tree, her breath visible in the morning air. Leaves drifted down beside her like silent messengers from a world that had paused just for her. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. But her mind was replaying every line of that board, every angle of the solution, searching for flaws she knew weren't there. Inside the building, the review panel gathered quietly. She didn't just solve it, one professor said. She reframed the entire question. That kind of thinking is rare. Professor Kent crossed his arms. I've read doctoral dissertations with less clarity than what she just presented. Are we agreed, then? Asked the lead examiner. There was no objection. Meanwhile, Eliza remained still. No one called her. No one came to get her. Until finally, the large double doors creaked open. The coordinator from earlier walked toward her with an envelope in hand. Not a thick one, just a single folded letter. But the expression on his face told her everything before she even touched the paper. She stood, accepted the envelope, opened it. Inside was a plain sheet of paper with one centered line. You have been awarded full early admission to Washington University Advanced Theoretical Sciences program. Below the sentence was her name, typed neatly. Her fingers gripped the letter tightly, then loosened. She had done it, not as a star student, not as the loudest voice in the room, not as the teacher's favorite, but as herself, back in Dalton Academy. The news spread before she even returned. By Monday morning, Eliza's name was on every hallway monitor, every school newsletter, every mouth. But she didn't walk any differently. She still wore her old shoes. She still sat in the back. Only now, everyone looked back at her. And Mr. Raymond? He stood at the front of the classroom with a renewed look in his eyes. He didn't begin the lesson immediately that day. Instead, he addressed the class quietly. We all miss something, he said. Something important. He looked toward Eliza. She didn't meet his gaze, but she didn't look away either. She reminded us, he continued, that real brilliance doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits until we're ready to listen. The class was silent. No one dared interrupt. Days passed, but the effect of Eliza's achievement didn't fade. Emails began flooding the school's inbox, journalists, education blogs, podcast hosts. They all wanted to feature the girl who had shattered expectations without ever raising her hand. Offers came from summer institutes, research internships, even international programs in Europe and Japan. But Eliza declined them all. Every single one. She wasn't interested in fame. She didn't want to be a story. She just wanted time to think and space to learn. Still, something else had changed, quietly but unmistakably. More and more students began staying after class, not to talk, but to ask better questions, to understand, not just memorize. Even Joshua, who had spent weeks in denial, walked up to Eliza one afternoon and handed her a graph he'd been struggling with. "Can you check this for me?" he asked. She nodded, pointed to a subtle mistake near the axis labels, then handed it back without a word. He looked at her with real admiration for the first time. Valerie, on the other hand, kept her distance. But one day in the library, she sat down at the same table as Eliza. No greeting, no conversation, just silence. But that silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like understanding. Meanwhile, Mr. Raymond began revising his entire curriculum. He rearranged the seating chart so that no student was ever stuck in the back again. He started calling on the quietest kids first. He even wrote an article for a National Educators Forum titled, "The Student I Never Saw Until She Changed Everything." It went viral, but Eliza never mentioned it. One Friday afternoon, as winter crept into town, she stood at the school's rooftop garden, a quiet place few visited. The wind tugged at her jacket. In her hands was a fresh notebook, the first page still blank. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel behind. She didn't feel hidden. She felt ready. Behind her, the rooftop door creaked open. It was Mr. Raymond. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, stepping beside her. Eliza looked at him. "I like the quiet." "I know," he replied, "but you've made a lot of noise this year." She smiled faintly. Then she asked, "Do you think I was meant to be here?" Mr. Raymond shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I think you were meant to go further." Winter break arrived, and with it, a thick envelope arrived at Eliza's home. This time, not from university, but from the State Board of Education. Inside was a formal request. They wanted her to appear as a guest speaker at a statewide academic symposium, not as a contestant, not as a student, as a keynote. The event would host hundreds of educators, researchers, and top-performing students from across the state. They wanted to hear her story, her process, her mind, but Eliza hesitated. She wasn't afraid of standing on stage. She wasn't afraid of sharing her thoughts. She was afraid of becoming something she never wanted to be, a symbol. She sat in her room that evening, staring at the letter. Her old backpack lay beside her, and inside was the same worn-out notebook she had carried since the first day at Dalton Academy. The pages were now full, the corners bent, the spine cracked. She flipped through it slowly. There, in her uneven handwriting, were every idea, failure, and breakthrough she had lived through over the last few months. She thought of all the times she had been ignored. She thought of the whiteboard, the panel of judges, the maple tree, and Mr. Raymond's envelope. And suddenly it was clear. This wasn't about fame. This was about space. Space for kids like her. Space for silence to mean strength. So Eliza wrote back. She accepted the invitation, but under one condition. Her talk would not be about genius. It would not be about victory. It would be about visibility. On the day of the symposium, Eliza stepped onto the stage in front of rows of folding chairs and people with notepads. Her hoodie was replaced by a clean navy sweater her mother had bought just for the occasion. Her hair was still messy, her voice still soft, but she stood tall. She began not with a speech, but with a question. "How many students in your school," she asked, "sit in the back and never speak?" No one answered. She continued, "I was one of them. I'm not anymore. But I didn't change. You just started listening." She talked about diagrams in the dark, about learning from shadows, not spotlights, about how the world often waits for someone loud, but needs someone thoughtful. By the end of her talk, there was no applause right away, just a long, quiet moment. Then the sound rose, slow then thunderous. Mr. Raymond, watching from the second row, wiped his glasses with his sleeve. He had never been prouder in his life. Spring arrived early in the Pacific Northwest that year. The trees lining the streets near Dalton Academy were already budding with pale green leaves, and the air carried a softness that made everything feel new again. But for Eliza, the world wasn't new. It was finally visible. Back at school, her days were quieter than the storm she had created. She still sat at her usual desk, but now it was no longer in the shadows. Her presence had changed the entire classroom. Students who had once fought to speak now took time to think. Mr. Raymond no longer rushed through lessons. He listened more and spoke less. But Eliza's time at Dalton was drawing to a close. In just a few weeks, she would be boarding a plane to California, where she would begin her studies at Stanford under the mentorship of Professor Kent and his graduate team. She had already been granted her own research corner inside the advanced lab. And yet, in these final days, Eliza found herself returning to one unfinished page in her new notebook, one that had remained blank for weeks. The title at the top read, "The Equation That Started It All." She sat at her desk one evening, pencil in hand, and stared at the page, not to redo it, not to relive it, but to reframe it. Because now she understood this was never about the equation itself. It was about being seen. It was about all the times she had been walked past, spoken over, dismissed, and how one act of courage had shattered all of it. She began writing not just the math, but the thoughts behind it, the reasoning, the visualizations. And in the margins, for the first time, she wrote in complete sentences. "This was how I saw it when no one else could." When she finished, she didn't show it to anyone. She simply closed the notebook, placed it in her backpack, and looked out the window at the fading evening sky. The next morning, as the school prepared for graduation week, Eliza walked past the trophy case near the front office. Something new had been added. Behind the glass, a framed copy of her original riddle solution, signed at the bottom in her handwriting. Students gathered around it, pointing, whispering. She walked past them without stopping. Outside the building, Mr. Raymond was waiting. "I heard Stanford's letting you start your own research topic," he said. "They are," Eliza replied. "What's it about?" She smiled. "Perception," she said. "How what we see changes what we believe is possible." He nodded, then offered her a small handshake, awkward but full of pride. She took it, and then she turned, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the crowd of students and parents and faculty. No longer the quiet girl in the corner. Now, she was the one they all looked toward. Because sometimes the loudest legacy begins in silence.